Hi, and welcome everyone to Whole Soul School and Foundation's second Fireside Chats for September 2019. My name is Marie Mohler. I am an author, intuitive, and co-founder of Whole Soul School and Foundation. I'm here with my co-host and co-founder, Lacy Frazer, who is a clinical psychologist by training and a practicing life and leadership coach and consultant today. We welcome our listeners joining us today for our second edition of Fireside Chats for September 2019 as we continue our conversation about engaging our spiritual nature through the lens of the film Awake, the Life of Yogananda. And I welcome you, Lacy, to this important conversation today to share a little with us about the description of this film so that our listeners can get a sense of who he was and why this film serves as a powerful illustration of remembering ourselves as spiritual beings having human experiences versus being simply human beings having a few spiritual experiences sprinkled into our life journeys here. So welcome, Lacy.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you, and hello to everybody. I think it couldn't be more fitting than to share this particular movie about this amazing guru in our monthly series about engaging our spiritual nature. Paramahansa Yogananda, is considered one of the preeminent spiritual figures of modern times. He is the author of the best-selling spiritual classic Autobiography of a Yogi and is a beloved world teacher. He's a beloved world teacher of yoga, and he really was the one who brought yoga to the West from the East. So I thought I would go ahead and just read verbatim the back of the DVD, which does, gives the best description of all of what this film is about. So it's called Awake, the Life of Yogananda, and it is an unconventional biography about the Hindu Swami who brought yoga and meditation to the West in the 1920s. Yogananda authored the spiritual classic Autobiography of a Yogi, which has sold thousands of copies worldwide and is a go-to book for seekers, philosophers, and yoga enthusiasts today. And apparently, it was the only book that Steve Jobs had on his iPad. Just a little personal note there.
Yeah.
By personalizing his own quest for enlightenment and sharing his struggles along the path, Yogananda made ancient Vedic teachings accessible to a modern audience, attracting many followers and inspiring millions who practice yoga today. Widely recognized as the father of yoga in the West, he founded the Self-Realization Fellowship in 1920 and the Satsanga Society of India in 1917, which continues to carry on a spiritual legacy worldwide today under the leadership of his closest disciples. So the teachings of Yogananda, obviously, it's amazing to me that he was actually born in 1893 and he died in 1952. So, and he brought yoga over to America, which the film talks about in 1920, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's just amazing to know that his teachings have spread and serve as a foundation for yoga and meditation and spirit and how we as human beings connect to our spiritual nature even today. And really, that is what yoga is all about. And what I really just kind of as an overall comment about the film, it's really neat how they wove together actually archival footage of him talking, archival recordings of his actual lectures, and then many of his disciples talking about his teachings and how it's impacted their lives, and then how the teachings are being carried on. So it's a very it's a wonderful film that, again, really syncs up to our theme this month about connecting to our spiritual nature. So let's talk a little bit about the content in the film, which is really about his life, which is based also in his autobiography, in how he sort of entered our American society.
Yeah, Lacy, before I get into a little bit more about the film and how it opens, when I just was hearing you talk, a lot of his life, to me, was about weaving together this expansion of consciousness, right? Of
Yeah.
human consciousness into understanding ourselves as the divine. But as part of his living example, he was somebody that brought the East to the West.
Yes.
And he was somebody who understood the light and the darkness. He was somebody who understood the dualities that we play out here and was bringing a more personal perspective, a more personal experience of consciousness that he understood from his own spirit, I think, and also with from his training with some gurus that was centuries old. He brought that deeper understanding to the West, and it's just interesting how we've seen that flourish over the last 100 years.
Absolutely.
Right? If we're, 2019 and he came to the States in 1920, it's almost been 100 years since his arrival here. Mm-hmm. And, the expansion that we've all benefited from because he catalyzed that weaving of the duality back together. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's extraordinary. When we gain perspective on how we have yoga and this more personal experience of consciousness in our consciousness in this country, in this, in this part of the world, it's because also people stepped up to live their purpose and bring those messages to us in 2 different regions of the world so that we could grow.
Yeah.
And so I was going to talk a little bit about how the film really opens with the voice of Yogananda talking about being conscious in his mother's womb. That he had this awareness of being in a helpless state inside the womb and watching and being aware of light and darkness and what is human and what is spirit. And this felt like this was going to be his path, his life path, to be a teacher of this consciousness. And so I don't know about you, I have memories pretty far back, but I don't have conscious memory of being in the womb. But to hear his story, it's pretty extraordinary that he came in with such a great awareness.
Well, and I think that's such a sign of his soul as teacher from the beginning, of the purpose of his soul and the incarnation, his incarnation, I think that is a remarkable statement. I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, so I'm not talking about, what it was like in the womb.
Utero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, I think it's pretty remarkable, and I think he absolutely lived the path he was meant to live.
Well, and that he lived, I might even say that he lived a consciousness that lived outside the confines of time. So his ability to remember back into the womb as a consciousness is because he had transcended, a lot of the traps of time that many of us in our daily lives get caught up in. And so when you do tap into your deeper spiritual nature, that's why I think a lot of people feel more free. It's why it is part of the quest of the human nature is to rediscover our spiritual nature, right? We're trying to rediscover our spirituality and our divinity.
Yes.
So, he in the film, there's many points to be made in this film. There's a lot of amazing quotes and insights, and we're just going to go through some of them for our listeners who may or may not watch this film. But that he taught that yoga is the use of the body to expand your mind, to expand your consciousness. And so he was very tapped into this world. He was very tapped into this consciousness from the very beginning, as we've said. But around the time of 1920, he's in meditation and he falls into this kind of blissful state. He says that he fell into an ecstasy during meditation, and he receives this deep message that he is to bring the teachings of yoga to America. And he follows this message from Spirit, and he already has a pretty full life in India. Right? So you see this in a lot of the spiritual masters that know when it's time to listen, when a message is given and it's part of your life path, that it must, it's something that we honor. And so he had already had a school and he had a life and he had people he knew. But when he got this guidance, he honored it. And so in 1920, from that moment on, he starts aligning his life to get himself to America. And he arrives in Boston Harbor in 1920.
Marie, if I can interject here, I think one of the hallmarks, or I don't know if hallmark is the right word, but one of the markers of our own tuning in to a higher consciousness is really this notion of intuition and our sixth sense that we talked about in our last podcast, and getting messages that we feel ultimately compelled to follow, and it's listening to that higher guidance. And so many of us spend our life dismissing that guidance, minimizing that guidance, not paying attention, choosing something else, usually what the ego wants to choose, right?
Right. Being distracted away from it in some way.
Right. And so I think and I know you and I have had times when we've listened and when we've not listened, and we see what happens when you don't listen. And it's ultimately never really a good thing, although you always learn lessons from that. But, I think it's really amazing, admirable to witness somebody follow the guidance, follow it through, step into the unknown and trust.
Right. And to not give in to fear.
Right.
I mean, you can imagine if he had gotten that guidance, right? And instead of bringing this whole consciousness to the West, never did that,
right,
and gave in to the fear and said, oh, that's too big a task. Or, oh, I don't know how I'll do that.
Right.
That was nice guidance and that was a nice message, but I don't think so. And right, it changes, the world changes in the choice points we all make.
Right.
Right. And this was his choice point to make. He received guidance, and it was up to him and his consciousness whether he was going to listen to that. But, thankfully he did. And he does come here in the 1920s. And he gives his first lecture in 1920 is on the science of religion.
Now let's just think about that for a minute. It's 1920.
Yeah.
And he's going to lecture on the science of religion.
Yeah. He brought a whole new world of thought to people who, I think we're going to get into this, but, where, people were going through their lives, and pretty much in their practiced religions, and probably not giving much thought of how science connects with religion.
Right.
But how many things connect with their religion, including their own consciousness.
Right.
Because this was not a language that was likely going on.
Well, what's interesting is in the film they do reference that this was a time of who was alive and well at this time was Albert Einstein. And Einstein and quantum physics and quantum mechanics was just getting going in Einstein's world. So I don't know that Yogananda and Einstein knew anything about each other. They don't make that connection.
Yeah.
But I find it fascinating that Yogananda came to the United States around the same time, and his angle, his bent, his shtick, if you will, was spirituality and consciousness and connecting with the divine through the body, through yoga and meditation. And here's Einstein somewhere else talking about the science of quantum physics and the electricity that is running through our body.
Right.
And in this lecture in Boston, he states that the brain and the spine are the altars of God. That's how he describes them. And he talks about the electricity of God that flows down the nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and out into the world. And this is, I just think it's so fascinating because, he makes many points throughout this lecture, and we're going to talk about some of them, at least the ones that stood out for you and I. But this notion that he was really tapped into the universal energies and the energies within the body and the electricity in the body and how it flows from our brain and down our spinal cord through yoga, through meditation. And, again, in the meantime, Albert Einstein's talking similar language, but not as much about the spirituality piece and its connection to God.
Right. Yeah. And he goes on to talk about how we have a mental blueprint of certain electrical pathways in the brain, and that our lives follow the grooves that we ourselves have created in the brain. So we are rechanneling that energy. We are regrooving it in the brain, which is the whole point of yoga, right? So when we're moving that energy differently in the body in this very conscious way, in my view, he's talking about we can reset old patterns, we can free ourselves up from things that are not our spiritual nature, that are trapping us in sort of a limited human existence, and take us to a place beyond, which you see throughout the film. He definitely accesses other realms of consciousness.
Right.
Right.
And I think this particular point about a mental blueprint and electrical pathways in the brain, and that we have these grooves that we create with our thinking.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating to me, because here we are in the year 2019, and we have had a number of podcasts about thought and changing our reality with our thought, and spirituality and science, and how those things come together.
Conditioned beliefs.
And really the truth is, there isn't anything that you and I have talked about other than our own personal experiences that is new wisdom. I mean, this is ancient wisdom, and this is just a great example of ancient wisdom. Yogananda was a guru who learned from gurus who came over here, who, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was talking the same language that we're talking today. Because what that says to me is, your thoughts create your reality through your energy system. And that's what he was touching on here. And
he's tapped into a life force, right? When he's talking about that electricity of God, to me, that's what I might call life force, right? That's flowing through the nervous system, right? And out into the world, and out through our consciousness and into our daily experiences.
Yes.
And so it is very much a language that's been going on, for centuries. Only they seem to have been very tuned into it in the East in a way that it was passed down through gurus and people who were teachers of these messages.
Right.
And so I can't imagine, we'll talk about a little bit about this, what this was like in the 1920s if I was in the audience.
Right. Well, you probably were.
I probably was. I would have been super excited to be there.
Yeah.
And I think there's this, when somebody says something that our consciousness is ready for, we light up.
Yes.
We light up. We feel resonance. It feels familiar. We think something like, I know that.
Right.
Something about that. I know that. But he was saying things that were so radically different than the West's understandings of themselves on any level, probably.
And what was amazing about that is in the film, and they show it, thousands of people would show up to his lectures.
Yeah.
In Los Angeles.
Right.
In the 1920s.
Yeah. Yeah. Wanting to hear at least what he had to say. And I think Science of Religion, we think about podcast and podcast titles and movie titles. He was very smart, right? Before social media and the internet, to have a really powerful title that got to the gist of the essence of what he was going to be speaking. The Science of Religion probably got a lot of people's attention. Yeah. Right? Just the title alone.
Right.
So, yeah, I can certainly identify with wanting to be someone who would be in that audience listening to him. And so another point that he's making in this lecture, right, this very first lecture, in the 1920s, he makes the point that the searchlight of the senses are often turned outward. And this is where often, we're just conditioned and wired from an early age to look outside ourselves, to see ourselves reflected in the world around us, and to see ourselves defined by the world around us, right?
Well, and most importantly, in relation to religion, and this is my own personal sort of perspective here, but I always find that a lot of religions are about looking outside the self for answers. Right. That God is outside the self, that there's a power that is outside ourselves that's going to solve our problems, or that we pray to. I'm not saying I don't pray, but my prayer is always an inward prayer. I know that my power lies within me, and that there is a part of the divine in me.
And that belief that you have largely may come from what Yogananda brought to the West. Right. Because you might, if we didn't have access to that consciousness, things might have continued the way they were here. And we weren't connected, I don't think, to the sense of this personal connection with the divine. I think he was the one in his messages, as we talk about more things that he said and more of his quotes, he was bringing this concept that you are that connection. You have that connection. It's not outside of you. So if I say that again, he was saying that when the searchlight of the senses are turned outward, we're looking outside ourselves, right? But he said when you reverse the searchlights and they are turned inward through Kriya Yoga and concentrated in the spine, you will behold the Maker. You will turn inward to experience God. It's just such a powerful statement, especially for people who, in their own lives in the early 1900s, my grandparents were alive in the early 1900s, right? And just the practices that I would imagine they had in their lives was not really looking for their spiritual nature inside themselves, but believing more that God was outside themselves, and they were looking to find it through the many things they did with their faith and their lives and their, gifts of service to the world and their talents and their professions. But it was very much, disconnected that I am this divine life force, right?
Right. And, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole in a different direction, but I will, in a sense, bring something in here, which is I have not read the Bible, verbatim, but I do know that a big tenet of the Bible, or there's a big quote in the Bible that talks about the kingdom of God lies within. So I do think that man has probably distorted.
Yeah, we've played and understood these concepts in the spirit at a soul level in our divinity for a very long time. Mm-hmm. But when we've lived in cultures that in some ways, I guess that consciousness was a little more repressed. And we were conditioned in some parts of the world, including the West, for a good period of time, that somehow that spirituality and that connection with our divinity was outside ourselves. There is something, when you watch this film, you can feel he's sharing something that clearly feels very different to his audiences, that he's letting them know, right, that it exists inside themselves.
And people were responding.
Right, people were very much responding.
Because I think their spirit knew the truth of it.
Right. Even if their mind didn't fully understand it.
Right.
Their spirit resonated at some level with it.
Right.
And so
I love there in the lecture he talks about how the technique of meditation recharges the body battery with cosmic energy, right? And this is this is what self-realization teaches, and he was a big teacher of self-realization. So I just think that is the coolest phrase, that meditation recharges the body battery with cosmic energy.
To me, and that's that interplay between the life force of the cosmos and our consciousness as spiritual beings. And somehow through the techniques of meditation that he taught, and also he makes the point about in yoga, how your inner consciousness is connecting with the outer consciousness of the universe. So it really was with those two things, meditation and yoga, that you were connecting more deeply and more completely with your spiritual nature and this higher consciousness.
Well, and he also, even back then, I'm going to bring in the science again, because really what he's talking about is there is a mechanism, in a sense, for how this is attained, and he doesn't leave out the concept of electromagnetism, electricity running through the body, and that's, I guess, what he means by the science of spirituality. That's that when he talks about recharging the battery with cosmic energy, he's really talking about electricity. And through meditation, I don't know, I vision, I don't know if you do, but I vision, the crown chakra above the head opening, and cosmic energy, universal energies coming through our body and through the brain and down the spinal cord, and that electricity flowing through, right. And that's what animates us. That's our spirit. That's
right.
It's energy that fills our body with a focused concentration on that. Does that make sense? I don't know if I can just feel it.
It does make sense. And, where he starts off, I think one of his first points that he makes in this lecture is that he believed that the brain and the spine are the altars of God, and that those are the receptors of that life force energy and that divinity that's coming straight from Source, God, Creator, all that is, the great mystery, whatever you might call that infinite, pure positive energy of the universe. Right? He was tapped into that, and that we are receptors. All of us are receptors for that.
Yeah.
Right?
Antennas, in a way.
Antennas and conduits, where we can channel that electricity in our physical bodies in a way that makes a pathway for our consciousness to come through.
Yes.
But when that's disconnected in our consciousness, and we don't know that these things have any relevance whatsoever, that we're just, it goes back to, I think, last month's podcast, where we were talking about Newtonian science, that there's all these separate parts and they in no way really connect.
Right.
Right? And you could just see where that's gotten us in our world. And, in many ways, it's just not working. And I think, if we go back to, I'm not going to go back there right now, but if we think about Bruce Lipton and Lynn McTaggart and many of the speakers in the Living Matrix we're talking about, in fact, and Einstein was part of this, right? And there were a lot of quantum physicists waking up that we are a part of a much greater whole. And interesting, you're right, that like Tesla and I can't remember the scientist's name that was started with an S. It was a long, can't remember his name now.
Schlagenmeister or
something. But, they were tapped into a greater oneness in the universe, and they were seeing science and spirituality in the science. Yeah. And I think Yogananda was tuned into something very similar, but from a deeply, spiritual perspective that, as you were saying, has been handed down through the thousands and thousands of years, right? And so
he really helped people understand that meditation and yoga were not a creed or a dogma, but a science of the soul and the spirit. That's what there. That's kind of a quote from the movie, and it's about the soul descending from the cosmic consciousness into the earth, the body, and the senses, and that was the purpose of his work.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, he's definitely inviting people through his language and his words and the way he lived his life into embodying that too, into understanding that it's all connected.
Right.
That life force, that electricity, our brain, our spine, our body temple, and how we express ourselves, how our consciousness expresses through us, is all part of that greater oneness. Right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I loved how, at one point the narrator says, imagine hearing that God is in your spine in 1920. Right. It was a radical explanation of where to go to experience God.
I can only imagine, even today.
Yeah,
for people who don't listen to podcasts like this, or if you're listening to this and saying, that sounds really strange to me, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty far out there. It still is a pretty strange concept
and
to
controversial, I think, in some sects.
Yeah, fairly controversial still. So what was interesting to see in this film is, like you were saying earlier, is how many people would still show up to see his lectures. And he traveled. Here he was, a brown-skinned man with a turban from India in Boston, but then he ended up going out to Los Angeles in the 1920s.
Yep.
And then he ended up taking it on the road and going, through the U.S. and having lots of stops. And so, again, just picture in the 1920s, this brown-skinned man with long, dark hair, speaking these messages about God being in your spine in the 1920s.
Right.
And if that happened even today,
right,
it would be a pretty, amazing,
unusual
experience.
Right. And he filled lecture halls.
Yeah.
Which was incredible.
Yeah.
And now there's a yoga studio on every corner in 2019.
Right. 100 years later.
Yeah.
Right.
And I don't know, I don't know what you think about this, but this is a little insertion here, not a plan, but, I think there are a lot of people who practice yoga to practice yoga for the body, but I don't know if people are really practicing sort of the mind-body-spirit connection through yoga that it was originally meant to be. And maybe they are, and I just haven't
Right.
experienced
Or it might be the
it.
mind-body connection versus a mind-body-spirit connection. I'm sure it's so different for everybody. I mean, every spiritual practice, it's so individual.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's different for different people. But I think his intention was that you were connecting the brain, the body, the spirit of an individual, and connecting that life force that connects to God, that is the altar of God, channeling and coursing through your physical body temple as a consciousness, as a spirituality inside you. And so, this conversation on this podcast certainly invites people to consider that. And it was interesting to see in the film, anybody can I think rent this film, stream this film, or get the DVD, but you see him, throughout the film, him actually, doing yoga, leading meditations, and there's people in all kinds of yoga poses, and, there's a whole, I'm sure, and I've never read his book, the autobiography of a yogi, right?
Yep.
I haven't read that yet. It actually makes me want to read that book because I would like to hear in his own words a lot of the insights he was bringing through.
Well, there were a number of insights that came through in the film. There's his story that the film depicts, but there are a lot of insights and a lot of quotes that I loved and picked out. And one of the first ones I have here is, the doors of perception don't often open with the intellect. Something powerful has to happen to shake us out of our comfort zone. And I think that is so true as we travel this planet, as we travel this earth and this consciousness, that can be limited at times. We think that we've got to achieve a certain level of intellect and knowledge, and that can get us far in life. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a shift that's happening now on the planet that people are asking questions about meaning and purpose and connection more now than ever before.
Right.
And that while intellect is important in certain circles and in certain professions, it's not the be all and end all.
Well, it's that duality, that swing from the mind to the heart, the either or. Right. And most people don't even see it as an either or choice based on our conditioning. It's more just we're especially in schools, in the educational systems today, we're very much driven and guided and reinforced to keep going up into our heads, right? And further and further away from our hearts. I'm not saying that that's everybody's experience, but that's definitely sort of the overall conditioning that goes on. I don't feel like I had any classes called feelings, right? I don't remember seeing that one in my kindergarten class or anywhere along the journey. Maybe in pursuing my undergraduate degree and my master's degree in psychology, but they would have called it more emotions, and it would have still been more from a more cerebral perspective on what emotions are.
Absolutely.
And not that our emotions are expressing our consciousness in any way.
Right.
So I think he really was tapped into, and that phrase that the doors of perception don't often open with the intellect. Something powerful often has to happen to shake us out of our comfort zone and to almost shake us out of that hardened Buddha. That hardened, shell, the armor, of the ego's armor. Something has to, often enter our lives that shakes all of that armor off, where the armor is it was either ineffective, right? Or, it's not functioning. It's not serving us anymore.
Right.
And so, and they depict in the film, he has several experiences in his journey. One when he's much younger and his mother gets sick unexpectedly and passes away. So, that was a significant moment in his life where he's called to ask questions about why and the bigger picture. Even though he had this consciousness, he still had his human aspects inside. So isn't it interesting that he had the connection to his consciousness in the womb? But he still experienced human pain.
Yes.
He still experienced the sudden loss of his mother.
Yeah.
And that still called his human self to call out like we do. Why? like, what is the purpose of an experience like this, right?
Right.
And so it's in the questioning of that more answers come, and we grow and we expand our spiritual nature and we expand that connection. And he had several of these. He has some great success when he comes to the United States in many ways. And then he has some challenges with that success. I think that success may in some ways have threatened the establishment here and threatened certain political spheres and certain probably religious circles. I'm sure there were a lot of people who did not like what he was saying or sharing in this world.
Yeah.
And so I think he definitely went through some challenges and,
of course. I mean, he was a way shower, a light worker.
Very public challenges that were in the newspaper and, that sort of, took a stab at his integrity and his credibility and, in the school that he'd started, and I think it was in California.
Yeah.
So, that started to shatter the foundation of what he had begun to build here. And when that shatters, he left this country, and I think he went to Mexico for a little while and just was sort of in shock about what had happened. And he felt pretty rattled. And that's what they're talking about. Something powerful often has to happen to shake us out of our comfort zone. So even when he was doing well, Spirit calls us to even greater expansion. And, sometimes it's not all bliss. And spiritual teachers like this, often their life is an illustration of it's not always all roses. Right?
Well, I think 99% of the time, spiritual teachers are showing us the way through these experiences, through these adverse experiences.
And they model for us, if we have eyes to see and ears to hear, how we have to more surf the waves with not as much attachments. Our human selves are so good at getting attached.
Right.
His human self, I'm sure, was very attached to his mother when she got sick and died, right? And his success, I don't think it never seems that they paint him that he was attached to his success. I do think it must have felt like things were going so well, and he just probably thought that the teachings would continue to spread and they would continue to be shared, and he probably wasn't expecting the personal attacks that came his way. That's probably what was also shocking. But when you are tuned into this consciousness, when you engage the techniques of meditation and yoga that he was all about, somewhere deep inside, I'm sure he knew that he needed to go inward. I think we have a quote about that, so maybe a little bit later.
I think we talked about that a couple times already. Yeah.
Going
inward.
Going inward. I think, but it's a theme throughout the film too. I mean, he's definitely inviting, and we're not looking, I think he called it the searchlights looking outward.
Right.
He could have looked with his searchlights as his language, looked out at the newspapers and looked out at the media and looked out at everybody who is, making things challenging for him and his, all that he was trying to bring through. Or he could turn inward and ask those spiritual questions of what is this about? What are my next steps? Right? What can I learn from this? Right? What is the blessing in what this is? Right? Those are spiritual questions.
Yeah.
Most people from a human perspective are not asking those questions. They would just say, why me? Right? Right?
Well, it's a perfect segue to this next quote that I had written down, which is, our lives only make sense in the mystery.
Yeah.
And what that really means to us is that when we're trying to make sense of our human lives or a human perspective, our lives often don't make sense.
No.
But it's from a spiritual perspective that our lives can begin to make sense. And when we can see from a bigger picture. One of the most powerful exercises I used to do, and actually not used to, still do with clients, is kind of, I call it my Google Earth exercise, where I teach them how to see their life from a much higher perspective, like Google Earth, where you go from, seeing your
close up.
Really close up. You see your house and you zoom out and you see the neighborhood and the community and the town and then the state and then the United States and then the earth. And when you get that high up and you're looking down on your life, you really can put your life in perspective.
Yeah.
Right? And you can...
and not... Well, from that perspective, but especially from a spiritual perspective of really understanding that you're a consciousness, more than you're that physical body.
Right.
You're a spirit more than you are that human being. And your spirit has, I don't know if I'd call them requirements, but I would definitely say desires for this life.
Yes.
It has lessons that it wants you to learn. It has a purpose that you're meant to bring through. This is all what happens when people engage that hero's journey we've been talking about, and this journey of personal transformation. And we do zoom out, Lacy, and we do have something that catalyzes kind of the shattering of the small life and the ego's armor that we had previously been living in.
Right.
And it's devastating at the time, but as we throw off that armor and we throw off those limiting beliefs, we do start Googling ourselves out. We do start sort of moving
Right.
our way out into this higher perspective, and our language starts to change to even allow for some movement, some expansion. We can grow.
Right.
You know, it's just like I've said this before, but if we were still trying to wear the pants that we wore when we were 5, it's just nearly an impossibility. And that's how many people are still trying to pull on their 5-year-old pants. And we might be 50-year-old people.
Right.
And that's like a metaphor for the limiting beliefs many of us are still embracing just because we haven't yet let go. We just haven't let go. And so when we can zoom out in the way you're talking about, right, and we can really see ourselves from this higher, broader lens, so much more about our lives makes sense when we can start to see, oh, that was the lesson
Right.
in that time that I did this, and Uncle,
Because we see life in a way like a puzzle, and that's the missing puzzle piece.
right.
You know, or that's the breadcrumb that I forgot that I have to go back and pick up, or,
Right.
you know,
well, there was purpose in that
Yeah.
challenge. Like I realized that if I hadn't had that experience in grade school, you know, I might have never gained the strength and the stamina to face what I was going to face my first year out of college. You know, we can start to see the meaning and the purpose, but only when we get to this more,
Right.
this bigger picture perspective, this, you know, what the quote was, our lives only make sense in the mystery. When we're willing to zoom out
Yes.
into the mystery,
Yes.
we can look onto the mystery and trust that it is a mystery, but that there's something inside us that's leading us perfectly all the time. And I know that for some listeners, they say, yeah, I haven't gotten there yet. I'm just not having that experience. And
I can tell you that it's very, life becomes very exciting when you
Yeah.
live in the mystery. You
Yeah.
know, there's you don't know what's around every corner. And where there was a time where I might have lived more fearful of what was around every corner, now I just have anticipatory excitement around every corner, because I know no matter what, I'm going to learn from it, and I'm going to grow from it, and I'm going to expand from it, whether it's challenging or
Right.
it's joyful.
right, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant,
Right.
you know there's a gift and a blessing inside what you're experiencing.
Exactly.
And so I think, again, going back to his, you know, his 2 main techniques to achieve that connection and that consciousness and that connection with your consciousness is through the meditation and through
Right.
this yoga practice, and through, you know, and through his lectures and his teachings. So, you know, from a spiritual perspective, souls are on a journey, and people are on different levels in that journey. And there's a belief that, you know, he shares this message is that there is so much more to life than what we experience every day, especially if we are not connected to this higher consciousness, this deeper part of ourselves as being a spiritual being. And I think if I can reflect back, Lacy, for just a second, when we were talking in the first Fireside Chats and we gave a number of quotes from the author and teacher and speaker and intuitive Sonia Choquette, a lot of her, you know, early work was talking about, and still today I think is about, you know, there are people who live a 5 sensory life, a 5th sensory life, where you're living only from your 5 senses, sight, see, you know, or seeing,
feel.
hearing, tasting, feeling, touching.
Right.
And then there are the people who go into that 6th sensory state of awareness and consciousness.
That would be you.
And that would be me. And that would be a lot of people on the planet. And there's
Yeah.
a lot of people who don't know the language of being a 6th sensory. That's Sonia Choquette's term. You can call it being intuitive. You might be an empath. You might be somebody who is very sensitive, or, you know, you just were very tuned in at a different level. You felt things more deeply than other people around you felt them. But this is also, so it's just an issue of, or just an example of language. Sonia Choquette speaks about it this way. Yogananda was speaking about it in this way. Right? But there is this, there's this understanding, I think, when people go on this journey, that there is so much more to see. There's so much more to feel. There's so much more to be aware of. That's when life gets more fun, when it isn't this scary human experience of random acts befalling us, right? Or crushing us or challenging us and making us suffer. It's really a journey of the soul that keeps wanting to experience itself, learning and growing and expanding its connection with the divine. And it does this through all these different ways and these different mechanisms. So I think that just, again, I think they really, he and his devotees were really helping people understand that it's a journey.
Yeah.
Right? It's a journey. And that there are many beings, many people at different stages and different levels of that journey. We're all on a journey. Right? We're all on that journey.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I just know from the work that I have done for so many years, especially with men in prison, you get to a point where no matter who I've worked with or who I'm coaching or who's in my groups or my programs, the truth is you begin to see everybody as a soul on a journey having a human experience. And you can be in a room of 15 people and the 15 people are all at different phases of that journey, but you all have there's the common thread of searching for meaning and purpose,
right.
And it's
and they were all souls in an outer wrapping.
Yeah.
And then when you realize that, I'm not saying it makes it easy every single time, but when you have an awareness of that, of being a soul in a temple, a soul in a body, a soul having a human experience, you realize that the person next to you or the person across the state from you or the person across the world from you, they're a soul too, in an outer wrapping,
right.
having a human experience.
Right.
And it helps us to be more compassionate when we realize we're all souls having a similar journey that's incredibly distinct to us, but it mirrors everybody else's journeys. They're all trying to expand and grow and connect with the divine just like us, right. from all different angles and through all different levels of perception and consciousness.
Right. In here, that at some point they talk about that, we create a church within ourselves where we're the minister in the temple of our own soul.
Yeah.
That we are our own house, which is what you're saying. We
right.
are the spiritual beings having a human experience. And
yeah. I think it was we are the minister and the temple in our own soul.
Yeah.
Right? And then we provide, our bodies provide the structure so our souls can even be here.
Exactly.
Right? And we've gotten so attached and we've so over-identified with our bodies, right? We've forgotten that the most important thing to make space for and to make room for in our lives is our spirit, is our consciousness, because that's what's really animating us.
Yes.
And so with the over-identification with the physical body and to the, what is that? Not the devaluing per se, but we've disconnected, from our spirit.
Yeah.
That there's only one part of us activating and animating us through the day. And that you could just see that in the separation and the competition and the division and things that we see in our outer world. It's because we haven't made space for that consciousness, that spirituality, our spiritual nature to have a place inside us. And one of the best people who speak to this, I know we're talking about Yogananda, but for me it reawakens how beautifully Sonia Choquette spoke about this so early on when I connected with her work and her many books. And I think I don't know if I said this in the last podcast, but it comes up again today, so I'm going to say it again. If we don't nurture and create an inner garden, create this space that our spirit wants to be in, right? That our souls leave. They can't go very far, but they actually leave like being embodied inside us, right? They step out a little bit further outside of our consciousness, which makes it, in a reverse psychology way, a little easier for us to just live, these kind of drone-like human lives where we're disconnected from our own selves as spirit.
Right.
And so, but she talks about if you want your soul presence to really come alive and your consciousness to return, and what he was talking about, what Yogananda was trying to bring back, you have to create the physical body temple that knows how to support that kind of energy, that knows how to support your soul and your spirit in the ways that it needs to thrive and to want to be there. So we have to think about what are the foods we're putting in our bodies, what are the things that we're creating movement inside our bodies, to move that electricity he's talking about through our brain and spinal cord. How are we doing that, right?
And that's really the goal of meditation and yoga. It's to be able to consciously move that energy through our chakra systems,
right,
through the body,
and honor it.
Yeah,
and honor it as the gift that it is.
Right.
So I think we just have a few more points to make here. Deepak Chopra is in the film, and he describes Yogananda as a spiritual genius, as a spiritual prodigy. He said Yogananda had access to a domain of awareness that most people do not have access to. Right? Mm-hmm. He just, I think that's what, in the past, it makes us look to gurus. That's another thing. We can look to God outside ourselves, and we can look to gurus outside of ourselves. The truth is that we're all somehow having this inner guru, and it's teachers like this that bring us back to that awareness.
Yes.
That we're trying to create that body temple space where our spirit wants to join and partner with us and animate us and lead us and guide us,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And so I thought that was just a lovely explanation of Yogananda, that he did have access to that awareness. But it's not that only he can access that. We can all access that if we cultivate that connection.
Well, and
which is the theme this month, is how to engage our spiritual nature.
It's how to get, but our themes for the coming months, just to give our listeners a little teaser, we are going to talk about more in the realm of channeling and psychic abilities and things like that towards the end of the year.
Yeah.
And which is something that you know a lot about, and we both do, but you're a specific sort of expert in that, and I'm really excited to talk about that.
Yeah.
Which is, and this sets the stage for that for sure.
It does. Yeah, it's definitely in the realm of that level of consciousness.
Yeah.
So I think they also, Lacy, were talking about going back to yoga specifically, that it's through yoga that we can become one with peace, love, and joy, and realize that that is our true nature. And I know, again, you just have to imagine listeners to him, people listening to him in the 1920s might have thought that that was insane.
Right.
And people listening to us today could still think that that's insane. That the world is not just about peace, love, and joy, and everybody's going to be fine, and all go home singing and feel oneness, and everything's going to be perfectly healed on the planet. But in fact, to me, building off what they said in the film, but that what yoga is becoming one with peace, love, and joy, and realizing our true nature, that is the hero's journey we're on. That is the spiritual path we're on. No matter where you are, you're on some hash mark in a very long timeline. Right? You're somewhere trying to remember this inside yourself. So if you're listening to this and you're bouncing into it and you think, I don't really get that right now, but you might have bounced into it and you might come back 10 years later. Right? It happens to all of us. I don't think I've been ready for every kind of insight or spiritual awareness that I ever received, but I've definitely seen myself. Something comes back around. I said, oh yeah, I've seen that. I remember I saw that about 5 years ago, and now I'm ready for it. Right. I just didn't have either room in my inner life to assimilate that, to integrate that. And I find that as we journey further and further, we have more space, we have more receptivity. We're more of a receptacle for that higher consciousness and those higher insights. So
I think the other thing here, just to tie into that a little bit, is as we're talking about yoga and becoming one with peace, love, and joy, and realizing our true nature. Yogananda talked about yoga being a philosophical system set up to understand God. Yeah. And Kriya Yoga in particular is the science of God through meditation. Wow. So that's a nice sort of one or two sentences that really describe the essence of meditation and yoga, that it was a very, very spiritual system, a spiritual connection, and a spiritual engagement.
And a very internal and personal experience of God or of Source or, the infinite. Whatever words you use, Krishna, whatever words you use that, connect you with that pure positive energy in the universe.
Right.
It was a system that helped us connect on the inside with that. It took us in a place inside us.
Right.
And so in the film, at some point in his story, World War II happens.
Well, and this is sort of towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
He World War II happens and his guru in India dies. And at that point, he really, I think, they didn't say this, and I could be wrong, but I think he felt, to watch World War II happen was sort of catastrophic to the world and really makes you question, our human experience. And at the time that this happened, also his guru died, and he sort of, they talk
shattering,
about
another shocking experience to take him to the next level.
Exactly, and they literally talk about him going to the next level within himself. And there was even
go ahead. Well, just that it said, I think in his words, he said his body turned to stone in a kind of way, and that his spirit became more light, and he just began to channel and receive more of these insights. He was connected to another consciousness for much of the day, every day.
Right. And I don't know if that was his way of beginning to transition, because, in August of 1947, India declared its independence, actually an Independence Day, and in celebration of this, he was called to give a talk about India and America and his experiences
in both of those worlds.
And in giving a speech about these experiences and his love for these countries. And this was in 1947, and it was during this speech that I think the way it's talked about in the film, before he goes on stage, he says to one of his disciples, in a few hours, I won't be here anymore. And he knew that he was going to
He felt that ahead
pass.
of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was just so symbolic that I think, they don't say it, but it's so symbolic that on the day that he's giving this speech and preaching wisdom about India and America and yoga, meditation, and
the culmination of his life's work.
Exactly. And he knew, I think he probably knew it was done for now.
He felt his completeness.
Yes.
But it's interesting, as you just said that, I forgot. It's interesting, again, as he was the weaver of this duality, which they don't make that point. I'm just making that point, where he brought the East to the West, and he was taking us from looking without to looking within.
Yes.
And he was aware of the light and the shadow on this planet. They were all aspects of God, right? He kind of was a weaver of the duality, bringing us back into a wholeness of consciousness inside ourselves. At least that was some of what he was offering.
Yes.
So when he comes into this life, conscious of himself in his mother's womb, he comes into the womb very conscious, and he leaves this world so conscious.
Yeah.
He even knows his own death is coming within hours.
Yes.
And I think it's just a sign of we all can be connected at different levels, but certainly that level, if we engage this process and we go on that hero's journey and we have a dedication to these practices and these spiritual tools that will keep inviting our spirit to communicate with us, to commune with us, to connect with us. It's looking for a way in. And I think it lets us go for quite a while to have these human experiences, and even to create some messes and some traumas and dramas in our life. And we want that. And then at a certain point, the spirit will say, and it will get our attention.
Yeah.
And it will say it's time to do something different. It's time to make a different choice. It's time to grow. Whatever it'll do, it will extend an invitation of some kind that draws us back to the path of who we really are, what our true nature really is. And so, I think what he was offering are these sort of daily tools, this practice of meditation and the practice of the Kriya Yoga, that you don't have to wait until you get snapped back into a deeper consciousness from a challenge or a catalyzing experience or something that's difficult. we can actually engage this process to sort of do like a daily tune-up, a daily feeding of the soul and keeping that energy moving through our body as the electrical system that we are. He was offering that so we don't have to have crises in our lives. Not all of us choose that. A lot of us get so distracted and we enjoy all the experiences we're having so much as a human, challenging or not challenging, they're engaging somehow. And then at a certain level, our spirit says, let's take another step. Let's grow to the next level together, right? So, and so I think there's a couple more quotes and I think we're going to come to a close here, but I liked in the film how they were talking about this point that change has to come from the inside out. Mm-hmm. Right?
Amen.
That's when it becomes a personal experience. That is when it becomes an intimate relationship inside yourself with the divine, and that there's direct access to that experience. And many people, Lacy, of many faiths, achieve that through their faith. Many people do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just something for any one of us to be, tuned into. If we are in some kind of a practice, whether it's yoga, whether it's a certain faith, right? Whether we journal to connect with our spirit or we garden, whatever we're doing, we do need to review from time to time. Are my practices working? Do I feel filled from the inside out with love, peace, and joy in my true nature? And if we're not feeling that way, it's okay, because we're just in a journey. We're somewhere on that hash mark, on that line of timelines in the journey. But if we're not feeling that, it might just be time to try something new, or to get another book or learn a new perspective, or tune into a podcast like this where you're hearing from Yogananda.
Right.
And I hadn't actually heard about him until I saw this video on our bookshelf. And it made us tune into it. And you were familiar with it, I think, a little bit, but I had never seen it before, so it wasn't in my consciousness before. Right. So that's how it works. The minute you start asking the question from that place of our electromagnetism, whatever you next need is going to show up, through somebody through a friend, through an email, however it goes.
And we have to be paying attention.
And we have to be paying attention and listening.
Yep.
With our sixth senses, right, that are willing to see. So
why don't we end with just these sort of 6 phrases?
Yeah.
We'll alternate. And
well, I was going to say 3. They kind of go together in packets of 3.
Okay.
So I'll do the first one, and then you can close us out. Okay. I think that might be a little bit better because there's a continuity of these in terms of a vibration.
Okay.
And so the first set of quotes that they finished the film with pretty much is that he was aware his guidance was to watch the shore but not become attached to it. That he was an ocean of consciousness, and your guru is you, right? So if I say that to other people, I'd say, you can watch the shore, but don't become attached to it. You are an ocean of consciousness. Your guru that you're seeking is you, right? Mm. That's so powerful today. And, and just as much as it must have been incredible to hear those words from him, and a whole reset of some people's consciousness when they heard that it's been inside me all along.
Well, and what I was feeling as you were reading that is just, it takes the human out of it, the whole thing, in a way.
Yeah.
It just reminds me that this human package and the human ego and the dysfunctional thoughts, or whatever, all this human experience, it's just part of the movie,
Yeah.
that really what we really are. And I'm just going to go into my 3 here.
Yeah.
Everything is Brahma, everything is spirit, everything is light. Mm. So as we move from, the feeling I had when you were reading those 3 is, it just let's go of the human aspect of the self, and clearly in these last 3, what are we really? We are really light. We are really energy. We are really spirit.
Yeah.
And boy, it's amazing how it helps I almost said the word medicate, and that's the wrong word. It soothes. It's like a soothing balm to the human to know that the truth is that we really are just spirit, and we really are God, and we really are this energy that is so powerful.
Well, and that there's a much bigger consciousness that we can tap into. And the minute we think we've tapped into the biggest consciousness, it expands again.
Yeah.
And then we tap into that bigger consciousness and it expands again. And that's how we start to live the experience of the infinite. And for most of us in our human lives, most people aren't experiencing the infinite. In fact, they feel like they're trapped in these little small boxes, and there's no door, and there's no windows, and there's no way out. And so it is by bouncing into teachers like these, messengers of that light, messengers of spirit, whatever we want to call them, whether we think they're an incarnation of a master, whether they're a guru, whether they were sent directly from God. We're all that. We are all what that consciousness is. And it's just a matter of taking the layers off ourselves that we're not, and letting go our attachments to the layers we think we are, until we strip ourselves down layer after layer after layer to realize that inside we are actually pure light. And so that is the journey. That is the journey. And then we bring it back around and we teach it.
Right.
That's part of that hero's return.
That's right.
After we've stripped down some of the layers, I still have more layers to take off. I know I do. Doesn't mean that because we're doing these podcasts that Lacy and I or anybody else that represents Whole Soul School and Foundation doesn't have any more layers. The difference is we now know we have those layers, and we know we have this perfect inner light inside, and we're tapped into a higher consciousness. And then we're doing the work. We're in the journey. We're embracing the journey, and we're not letting fear change, to alter our path to rediscovering what we really are. And this gets off the subject of Yogananda, but I want to say Jeff Jones, who just did the transformation talks with us this month about engaging our spiritual nature. Anybody listening to this podcast should go check that out on our website or at YouTube, because Jeff has a lot of powerful insights about how he connected with his spiritual nature. And one of the things that he said to me recently is he's learned to embrace practicing his fear, right? Practicing his fear, which means being conscious of his fear, moving through his fear, opening his heart to his spiritual nature, knowing he can transcend that fear. That's also a very big part of this journey. And when we're doing the meditation, we're doing this conscious breathing we've mentioned before. When you're engaging yoga, I think Yogananda specifically taught this Kriya yoga. But when we're using spiritual tools like this, it really helps us to connect with that which we already are, that which we timelessly are. We are that light. We are that spirit. So, Lacy, and I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us in this important conversation about this film, Awake, the Life of Yogananda. He was a teacher and messenger that God lives in you, that Source lives inside you, that it's not outside of you, but within. And through the practice of Kriya Yoga, this incredible spiritual science, that people could reunite their soul with spirit or God. So in a world today, as we've referenced, Lacy, that often expresses or reaffirms so much disconnection, separation, competition, and division, it is soothing, uplifting, and inspiring to also see how many beautiful teachers and messengers there have been on this planet throughout time, who have committed through the example of their lives and their teachings to try to illustrate and reflect back to humanity that we are divine beings, that we are spiritual beings having human experiences, that we are actually filled with a life force that is organic and that is organically whole, and that if we engage and embrace spiritual tools like meditation and yoga, we ourselves have and hold the power within to reconnect ourselves to that inner union with the divine. So I want to invite any of our listeners to certainly like this video, to subscribe to our channel, or to go over to our website at www.wholesoulschoolandfoundation.org and subscribe to our newsletter there. And to please share this podcast or any other podcasts and videos that you find you resonate with to help spread the word about Whole Soul School and Foundation's offerings and our inspirations in the world. So please visit us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to check out our reminders for the soul posts, which are inspirational messages that we post twice a week, talk about medicinal doses. Those are nice little tune-ups that anybody can access on those social media platforms. And in those those weekly posts, we also include poems by our mystic poet, Flower Diamond, who has an amazing way of expressing insights and inspiration for the soul. So, and lastly, of course, we would ask you to please consider making a donation to Whole Soul School and Foundation. You can make a one-time donation or a monthly sustainer donation that really helps us further our mission and our vision of creating a better world. And every donation helps us to really continue to offer these podcasts and videos and to actually launch several key projects we have our hearts and minds focused on that support people whose lives have been impacted by incarceration. So thank you, Lacy.
Thank you, Marie.
And thank you to our amazing Whole Soul School and Foundation audience, supporters, and listeners for joining us. We'll see you again in October. I don't know the topic right now, so I'm joining my respect and reverence for the great mystery. And I will learn with the rest of you what our topic will be for next month. But we will definitely be continuing this journey of personal transformation and going deeper into this consciousness and this connection with our spirituality. So thank you for joining us. Have a great day, everyone. Blessings.